During the introduction, I described the area around the River Exe as a hotspot of innovation, yet even Exmouth pales into insignificance when compared with the Hamble River back in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The area was home to Proctor Mars, Bruce Banks Sails and Fairy Marine, who were builders of a whole dynasty of sailing dinghies that date from that golden post-war period. They did the Firefly, the Swordfish, the Jolly Boat, the 14, and then later on in their story, the 505. We will shortly return to Fairy Marine, but first we have to go back to the conclusion of the event at Itchenor. The IYIU now called for a new and hopefully final set of trials that would take place out on the bay at La Balle in western France during the summer of 1953. This left little time for John to design an all-new dinghy and then get it built, but he'd go back to the drawing board, setting out his thoughts for what he hoped would be a boat that was closer to that ultimate racing dinghy ideal. However, we have to remember that John wasn't doing this in isolation, which introduces into the story the businessman Max Johnson, who, despite being somewhat larger than life, was a close friend with John. Max had spent some of the wartime years in the US, where he had learnt of this magical new material called fiberglass, which he saw as a way to make his fortune. The pair, John and Max, would discuss ideas for a radical new dinghy, one that had a key factor that it would be ideal for moulding in glass fibre, with Max then commissioning John for the design. It's well documented that at the same time, up on the East Coast, Austin Farrer would also be busy at the drawing board, working on a radical international 14 called Thunderbolt, after he had found that whilst there was a minimum hull beam stipulated in the 14 rules, there was nothing in the way of a maximum. Now Austin knew that simply making a beamier hull would have increased the surface wetted area, so instead he opted for a more conventional hull form, which he then topped with an extended gunnel. John was looking to add a similarly extended gunnel to Coronet, and we know beyond doubt that there was an ongoing discussion between the two, in which case he raised the issue of using the gunnel in his own design. Farrer's response would be that as the IYIU were already moving to ban the use of hollows in the topside of his International 14, which would make that Thunderbolt shape illegal, that John was to feel free and use the extended gunnel on whatever boat he wanted to design. The established narrative of today suggests that the 505 is just a trimmed down Coronet, and if you look carefully at the hull lines, as drawn by John Westell, there are clearly some strong similarities in the two boats. At this point in our story though, the 505 is still way off into the future, so instead we will start by making a more detailed appraisal of Austin Farrer's Thunderbolt. We're lucky that we have both pictures and some of Thunderbolt's hull lines, though the hull itself, shorn of those iconic extended gunnels, was last seen in a poor condition somewhere over in the USA. But looking now at Thunderbolt, what do these pictures tell us? The hull form itself is demonstrably a slightly beamier development of other Farrer designed 14s, plus it has the extended gunnels, with a constant radius of 2 inches or 50 mm between the vertical element of the hull topsides and the underside of the flange shape that the gunnel extensions create. The flare in the hull can be seen to be even more exaggerated in the forward sections, which is hardly a surprise in a class where the hull was open to the elements and in these days before self-bailers and transom flaps. So let's now move on to John Westell's Coronet. When dinghy designer Keith Callaghan examined these lines, he was very impressed at just how radical they were when compared to any other International 14 hulls, the benchmark of the day. For those that are interested in these technicalities, for the upcoming 505 book, Keith Callaghan is producing some very revealing 3D images which show that John's lines for Coronet were far more radical than those of Thunderbolt. Thanks to Keith, you can see an overview of those lines here. Coronet's hull weight was light, at only 118 kilos, with John calculating that with two fairly heavy men on board, the boat would be at its design displacement of 320 kilos. John would talk of how he was able with Coronet to exploit that freedom from the existing 14-star rules, where the overall hull length limits dictated that the boat would have a plumb bow. Instead, he was able to give Coronet a lovely bow profile which ran into a rocket hull, with John's thinking being that the shape would minimise surface wetted area for light air's performance. Then, when planing started, the stern would sink and the bow would lift. He had calculated that Coronet's surface wetted area was 14% greater than that of a 14, not surprising seeing that the boat was 4 feet longer, so he would give the boat a similar increase in sail area over that of the 14. Further thinking was that the extended gunnels would not only deflect the spray from the bows outwards and downwards, but at the same time would increase the righting power in the hull. It's worth noting here that in these original lines for Coronet, it was the helm and not the crew that had access to a sliding seat that would be pivoted on the flange below the gunnel. There's also mention of a sliding seat being an option for the 505, but this may well have been a sop to the IYRU, who seemed resistant to the wider use of the trapeze. John, though, was not a fan of the sliding seat, and after the trials at Itchener, he would be a signatory to a letter that went to the IYRU stressing the need for performance dinghies to include the trapeze as standard. There would be one other consideration for John, whose personal makeup included a hefty helping of that classic engineering conservatism. He knew that with a light, beamy hull that flexing could be an issue, so he would include one other feature which may well be another first, as he gave Coronet an internal space frame constructed from aluminium tube. With the lines drawn, John would ask John Chamier, who was already been building championship racing dinghies at his Tormentor yard on the Hamble, to build Coronet, and the boat would be launched in May 1953. Once the prototype had been finished, John, Max and a number of the other top local helms would put the new boat through its paces, and from the outset Coronet would prove to be a sparkling performer, even though a delay in organising a new rig would see the boat sailing with an old suit of international 14 sails. Coronet would also feature a number of radical innovations, including a box section speed boom and an underdeck lever to tension the forestay that would allow the crew to easily change from a genoa for sailing off-wind to a jib for going up the beats. Once afloat, Coronet could now join the other boats designed with the IYRU trials in mind that were already practising out on the Solent, including Claude Nethercote's Marianne, which would be something of a challenge for him to master, because this was like a stretched Merlin rocket with an extra length sliding seat and a huge spinnaker. Ian Proctor, fresh from winning the Merlin Rocket Championships, would be sailing the Osprey, but together they would all need to be on their top form, as the rumour crossing the Solent from Cowes was that Uffa Fox was going quickly in his jolly boat, whilst Jack Holt's simple, hard-chine Hornet was benefiting from being part of a fast-growing and active class that was being sharpened up by good quality fleet racing. Ahead of Laballe, the big test for not only John Westell and Coronet, but for all these new boats, was about to come in a novel format of a one-lap race. But that one lap would be around the Isle of Wight. Today we can celebrate the famous Rainy Island race, which starts and finishes here at Cowes, as not only one of the great sporting occasions of the year, but one of the largest standalone sailing races there is. As over 1,500 boats often come to the start line, sometimes more. But 68 years ago in 1953, an extra and very special version of this race was run, just for dinghies. This would be no mean feat, for even as the crow flies, without any beating to windward, it's still 60 miles around the island thereabouts, with the area to the south of the island known for its lack of shelter. But for 1950s dinghies, early 1950s dinghies, many with only minimal buoyancy, no transom flaps nor self-bailers, with the exception of the crew, just completing this course would be an achievement. All the more so as the entry was open to boats as small as 12 foot, which saw both Fireflies and National 12s entering. The focus, though, would be on the 5 boats that were already destined for the IYRU trials at Wesle. Ian Proctor had been here out in the Solent, practising hard with his Osprey. Plus, he had his team at Proctor Mass making a number of bespoke fittings. Arthur Fox, who lived in the house just behind me, was out sailing Fairy Jollyboat, and of course he had the benefit of his extensive local knowledge. Whilst Jack Holt's Hornet was already a strong class, which had helped make their entry race ready. For the 2 new one-off boats, Claude Nethercott's Marianne could be fast, though was proving very tricky to sail downwind, and of the other boat, of course, John Westell, Max Johnson in Coronet. John and Max Johnson were something in the way of latecomers to this competition, which meant that not only would they lack time on the water, but that the delay in ordering their new rig would result in Coronet being sailed with a cast-off suit of International 14 sails, though John's radical new speed boom would be in use. All these boats were expected to be front runners in the race, and they wouldn't disappoint. Proctor was the early leader, but despite their problems, Westell, Johnson and Coronet would be challenging them as they headed westward down the Solent towards the Needles, before eventually taking the lead. Coronet's undoing would come on the long beat from St Catherine's Point to the eastern tip of the island, for the race was being sailed in an easterly breeze. Proctor had a crew of 2, Cliff Norbury and John Oakley, both set up to crew from the trapeze, though only one at a time. In contrast, Coronet would struggle, for John Westell had believed that the best way to rig the trapeze was to have the wire connected to the end of the spreaders. With the course heading into a foul tide, short tacking along the island shore was an essential element for success. Westell's idea of taking the trapeze up to the tips of the spreaders would be a mistake. He didn't make many, but this was one of them. In contrast, Proctor, with his conventionally rigged trapeze, was able to power through, whilst Arthur Fox would use all his local guile to challenge for the lead. Then, late in the day, with the wind easing, the long run back to Cowes from Bembridge would bring Marianne, flying her large spinnaker, right up into competition, a factor that Westell took particular care to note. After sailing all day, there would be an incredibly close finish, but Proctor would get the win. Westell, however, would get the necessary experience that would be crucial for Coronet when the boats met again at Wesle. Westell would also go back to his friend Austin Farrer for a radical design of spinnaker that would be as big as the one on Marianne. Farrer had been teaching himself the complexities of spherical trigonometry, a discipline that would eventually unlock the secrets of improved spinnaker design, and Coronet would certainly benefit from this. Now, France isn't that far away from here, and roll-on, roll-off car ferries leave several times a day, linking Portsmouth, just across the water, to various French ports. Back in 1953, however, getting car and boat across to France would be no easy matter. Nevertheless, this is where Westle and Coronet were headed next. Today, even post-Brexit, we can still get into our cars and drive through the Channel Tunnel to France. But back in the early 1950s, getting across to Europe to compete in an international event was a major undertaking. Thankfully, things had just begun to get easier, as 1953 would see the start of a drive-on car service to France, as until then vehicles and trailers would have had to have been hoisted aboard. Despite driving on the continent with a boat on a trailer being something of a challenge, that summer of 1953 would see a number of teams leaving the UK, crossing the Channel, then driving some 450 miles through France to Laval. This would be a journey that would pose a number of unique challenges, and Ian Proctor, with Cliff Norbury and the Osprey, would be just one team that would suffer a breakdown on the way. As we can see here in this picture, dinghy trailers back in the early 1950s were rudimentary to say the least. On one sturdily built trailer is the Merlin Rocket, double stacked with Beecher Moore's Hornet, and behind them is Max Johnson's car, which is towing Coronet, complete with two rigs, the 14 one that the boat had been sailed with on the Solent, and the all-new larger Coronet rig. They would finally arrive at Laval, which for those who have yet to experience the pleasures of Western France is one of the best and certainly one of the most beautiful sailing locations in all of Europe. Once there, the process of sizing up the opposition could start, with a lot of attention being given to the radical Coronet. As we can see here, Peter Scott, who currently headed up the IYU, is leaning across the foredeck of a beautifully finished Coronet for a discussion with John Westell and Max Johnson. Scott must have been having some mixed feelings about the event, as the IYU sponsored boat, the Tornado, didn't even make it to the trials at Laval, but at the same time there would be so much innovation on display. Check out the Flying Dutchman to the right of Coronet, which features a fore and aft adjustment of the shroud base, but probably the most advanced boat on the beach would be Coronet. Before leaving for Laval, Westle had taken delivery of what he called a variable flow mainsail that included what today we would call a lens foot. Essentially it was loose-footed, but with a connection panel of a very lightweight cloth. There were two other key features of the boat, the first being a rotating semi-wing mast, and the second a telescopic spinnaker pole that could be extended out to 10 foot in length. Although at the request of the organisers, the pole wasn't used in this way. All the teams were put up in a grand hotel, and the boats were placed on the nearby sandy beach. In this picture, Coronet is in the background, but it is again using the International 14 mainsail, number 620. But Westle's innovative speed boom is clearly visible. The French would be there in force, with a number of their popular Canotton dinghies, plus several developments based on the boat. And here we have Jacques Lebron, the Olympic gold medalist for France at the 1932 Olympic regatta, and who was still competitive 20 years later with the Finns at Helsinki. Lebron, in his modified flying Canotton, would be a force to reckon with, and with several of the other boats being topped by French helms of the day. Another boat of note would be the 18-foot-long Thistle dinghy representing the USA, although this example had been made at Uffa Fox's Medina boatyard at Cowes. Now, with so much going on that week, it is well nigh impossible to compress the drama and sailing that took place out in the bay down into just a few minutes. But this picture of a start gives us quite a good idea of how the racing played out. Coronet is away and in clear air, but Proctor's all-clinker Osprey is about to be forced into attack by a boat that was something of a surprise package. The F on the mainsail of the starboard hand boat tells us that this is the Fleet Wing, a hotted up development of a Fairey International 14 sailed by Charles Curry. Now, by the standards of the day, there would be some strange methodologies employed by the organisers to determine the winner of these trials, with a cumulative time difference between the boats across all the races being a key factor. But in the end, the IYRU got the result they wanted, and it has to be said, had worked towards. Full international status could now be granted to the Flying Dutchman, but the star performer at La Balle had undoubtedly been Coronet, despite the boat suffering teething problems with its new rig. The worst of these would be issues with the mainsail, which comes as something of a surprise, as John Westell was a strict believer in attention to detail. But somehow the initial stretch that these cotton sails could suffer had not been fully factored in, with the result that even with the main sheet block to block, the sail could not be fully sheeted in. Nevertheless, in terms of raw speed, Coronet was now being described as the fastest two-man centreboarder in the world to date. Of the other British contenders, Fox's jolly boat would be described by the event committee as something of a disappointment, but one boat that did impress was the Hornet, sailed by Beecher Moore and crewed by his wife, the only lady competing at this event. Yet the events on the water were just the start, as no sooner had the racing finished than various negotiations back ashore could begin. Initially, the French wanted Jack Holt to stretch his Hornet to create a new one-design Canotton, only for Holt and Beecher Moore to say no, for they didn't like the idea of a Super Hornet class so close to their own shores. Jack Holt, though, referred the French on to his good friend Ian Proctor, but the canny and astute designer could already see a future for an improved Osprey as a domestic performance dinghy back in the UK. Finally, the French tried John Westell, but Coronet was as far from the boxy, hard-chine Canotton as it was possible to be. Moreover, John Westell and Max Johnson had already been given an offer from the IYRU. Change the name from Canotton, sell 100 boats, and Coronet, or whatever they chose to call it in the future, would be granted full international status. Yet, in one of the great judgmental calls in the history of our sport, John Westell, who had already formed a friendship with Alain Setier from the Canotton class, agreed to rethink his hull form, reducing the hull length and developing further that iconic flared hull shape. The only problem now was one of timescales. Could John design what would be pretty much an all-new boat, get it built, and then be able to demonstrate it to the French in what would be a record time? To answer that question, we now have to head back to the Hamble River, where the next act in this story is about to be played out.